He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 25 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and all things advertising. We're back again, Henry, and today we have an amazing, fantastic, legendary guest, George Tannenbaum of GeorgeCo, an LLC Delaware company, and he's going to be talking all about advertising. He's got a few pet peeves he wants to talk about, and we've got a scoop. We've got a scoop, and they're gonna have to listen to the very end of this episode to get that scoop, right? So let's join our conversation with George. Okay, Henry, we're back with another episode, and we are graced by the presence of the CEO of GeorgeCo LLC, a Delaware company, Mr. George Tannenbaum. George, it is a real pleasure to have you. I mean, you're a man who really doesn't need an introduction, but I want you to tell our 115 followers, we're growing in a year. We've been out for about a year, and there's 115 followers in our YouTube page. So I don't know what that average is a month, but we're growing. So many of our viewers will probably already know who you are, but what would you like them to know about who you are? And thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored. What would I like them to know? Just, I'm a guy who started working early in advertising. I never really had ambitions to be a screenwriter or anything other than an ad guy. And I've been making my living at it since around 1980, and I'm not ready to give up. So I keep trying to be good. I keep trying to get better at my craft and better with clients and just better all around. That's what I do. I work at it.
Well, that's a great summary. You're actually committed a little bit of sacrilege by admitting that you have no ambitions to be a screenwriter. I think every copywriter I've ever met has said there's a screenplay in me somewhere. So
well, there might be, but it's pretty recessed. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by your dedication to your process and your craft. I'm a writer like you. I have written 2 books on the creative brief. I have a 3rd book that's in its 4th draft. It's a memoir. I've written 200 pages of another memoir that's in a 1st draft, and 200 pages of an absolutely awful thriller that is going to stay in my drawer for a long time. So I understand the process of writing. I've written 5 books. I know how to write a book. And everybody has a different set of rules and regulations and what they do to be a good writer. And one of the things that I discovered is that when I don't write every day, but I don't beat myself up for not writing every day. And I admire you because you don't just say that you write every day, you do write every day. You have a blog post every day, and I have a hard time keeping up. Could you share with us for a minute what that craft means to you? How do you keep that craft polished, and how you get words out every day? How do you do it?
Well, some of it I have to say, just doubling back to the blog a little bit, the business I grew up in, the advertising business I grew up in, and I'll get to your answer. I never give a short answer. But the advertising business I grew up in was always one about how do I make you come to my restaurant, not the restaurant next door, or the paradigm, in the early 80s was there's a gas station on every corner. Why would I choose this one rather than that one? They're all equal, the same prices, same giveaways, same lack of service. Why would I choose one? Well, that's what a brand does. So you get to a certain age in this business, and you realize that the number of 50 plus, let's say, copywriters is dwindling, and the need for them presumably has dwindled along with the number. And you say to yourself, well, I want to keep working. How am I going to distinguish myself? Well, I need to get my name up to the top of the pile, and I'm going to do that by creating an ad every day. Basically, the blog, in a sense, or the ads for my LinkedIn, whatever, I hate the word content, but my LinkedIn content is basically an ad every day. It was maybe 15 years ago, a headhunter said to me, the traditional way of people finding creative talent, where you would send a portfolio, that's somewhat disappeared. A portfolio, if you think about it, is a look back of what you've done. And we live in such a quotidian world. We can now show every day what we do. And it's not that hard. So I would rather say, the advertising dicta is show, not tell. And so I'd rather show every day. Here's who I am. You're looking for someone. Here's who I am. And so it became very much, like if I were an athlete, I'd work out every day. I'd lift some weights every day. I'd do something every day. It became very much that discipline to put myself literally top of mind. That's my job.
Yeah, that's
the same thing I would want to do for clients. I need to do for myself.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, you have to stay polished. You have to stay practiced. And, Henry and I spend a good chunk of our time talking about creative briefs. We had Cameron Day on the episode a couple of weeks ago, or not that long ago. And like you, he's a freelancer.
Right.
So and we wanted to get his thoughts on how he deals with a creative brief. Now, he wrote a book,
yes,
which was a guide.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, and he has a chapter on the brief, and we kind of quizzed him about some of his thoughts on the brief. And one of the things that Henry and I really, admired about him is that a brief is often, for a freelancer, the only real knowledge you have about the brand, unless, of course, you are intimately familiar with the brand. And if you're doing a freelance work for Coca-Cola and you've drank Coca-Cola all your life, well, you know the product. But if you don't know the product, or you don't know the service, the brief is your entree. And so you expect and actually require more from that kind of a brief than if you were on staff working for that brand for your third or fourth or 12th year.
Right.
So why don't you talk to us for a moment, bringing some of your, writing craft thinking to this, if you wish. What is the process that you use to go through a brief when you have a new client and you don't know the product as well?
Well, part of what I often do with clients is to make myself easy to buy. It's hard to buy a freelancer sometimes. You don't know what you're going to get. You don't know how they're going to work. You don't know how responsive they're going to be. Is I say, I want to do this thing with you. If you tell me you have a week, that's different. But if it's a kind of positioning exercise or something slightly larger, I say I do this thing I call 363 or 484. I like to take 3 days to learn as much as I possibly can in 3 days. It's an intense course of going up to the helm of the ship and saying, I got to get it through the Straits of Molucca or whatever it is, and you got to do it. And you learn it. So I have 3 days to do that. I have 6 days to write and 3 days of revisions. Now, it's probably a little arrogant to say, but, after a certain amount of decades in the business, you do have familiarity with a lot of different categories, and you can draw parallels to a lot of different categories. You can see, a similar brand X is very much in the position of Volkswagen in 1959, unheard of, small budget, so they have to punch above their weight. Most brands are in that position. Mostly when you're a freelance, you don't get the leading brands. People are looking for a little bit of an insurrection. So, it is a job where you have to, I can't pronounce French well, or at all, but I read a book about a general in the Second World War, who was one of the most successful commanders. He wasn't one of the big generals like the Pattons or the Eisenhowers or Montes or anything like that. But I read a term in the book called it's like Trump to oil, but it's coup to oil, and you can look it up. Spell coup, C-O-U-P, and it's the ability of someone to come into a room or a battlefield in this case and size up the situation immediately. So I've written about this on my blog. I had been doing some work for IBM Watson, and we were one of the people we were shooting to talk to Watson ostensibly was the director, Sir Ridley Scott. And the director we were using at the agency was Joe Pytka. And Pytka and Ridley Scott are men of a certain age, big egos, super accomplished. And so I'm sitting with the two of them in a room. And Ridley Scott says, when I come into a room, I've shot 2,000 commercials. When I come into a room, I'm immediately sizing it up. Here's where the lighting goes. Here's where this happens. Here's where that happens. And of course, Pytka had to say, well, I've shot 4,000. But in any event, I think probably cops at a crime scene, to start taking or soldiers on a mission, Robert E. Lee would look for the high ground. Where am I going to put the cannons? How do I get an enfilade? How do I do this? And I would imagine when a cook comes into a kitchen, they size up the knives, they see what kind of spices you have. I think naturally, or do you remember that old radio show, the car talk?
Yeah. Yeah.
Remember those guys would often get, and it wasn't just for humor, they would often get people on the radio to try to imitate the sound the car was making.
Right.
And all they're really doing, they're buying time, and it's funny, but they're looking for clues the same way, any of us, any way a forensic doctor, a diagnostician would look for clues. Oh, it's 82 degrees out. He feels cold. Maybe he's dehydrated. They're going to start piecing things together like that. I think every professional, whether or a mom or a dad, everyone, or a brother, sister, everyone does that, maybe without realizing it. I think, when you get to a certain point in your career, you realize, gee whiz, how did I get to that? How did I get to that idea? And it's because you're seeing where they fit. You're seeing where the gaps are. You're seeing where the needs are. And I think that's part of what our business is. That's a process. With a lot of clients, believe it or not, I give them a poem that's called When Someone Deeply Listens to You. And a lot of what we do is deep listening. And no one's going to say to you, from a product differentiating point of view, there's not a great deal of differentiations, but you're going to have to find that. You're going to have to find why that's important. You're going to have to find why that the vanilla beans my wife buys are grown in Madagascar, and why that means something. It gives her a sense of credibility. And once if you're attuned, you understand how those little things make a difference.
You're basically making an endorsement for experience and for repetition, which is we're very big on that. Like I tell Howard all the time that brief writing is writing, and the best way to get better at it is to do a lot of it. And I think that you're right, that we all, with experience, and the more experience you have, the more you draw from, you're able to diagnose these things much quicker than when we're young pups that with our eyes as big as saucers walking into a room and not being able to really diagnose the situation as well as we do with some experience. I was laughing because you were talking about parents, and I think it's true. Like we've all seen like the first time parents, right? And how they're very different when the second or third child, because in
Yeah.
the beginning you think everything's an emergency. The child is choking, the child is dying, and by the third child, most people are like, they know what's an emergency and what isn't, right?
You're almost
Well,
making an endorsement, George, for no brief at all because of the level of experience that you have. You become a diagnostician of the problem.
well, I think, well, two thoughts before I get to that, if you don't mind. One
No,
is
no.
in terms of experience, a lot of people, my last days at Ogilvy, and people would see anytime there was or often when there was a major crisis, something fell through the cracks, it's due in an hour. It would land on my desk, and I would have four options, and people would say, "How did you do that?" And I'll say, well, I've written 6,500 blog posts. If they're an average of 300 words, I've written 1,000,008 words, 1,800,000 words. I've practiced. I've been doing the stadium steps for 40 years. So, that's number one, and that helps. And there are people, as we all know, who read better than others, who see things different. I don't, who can read, who can make those, I don't watch CSI, but make those CSI kind of connections on a blackboard between this thing that happened on 43rd Street and this thing that happened on 72nd Street. There was a feather at each scene. Does that mean something? Now, you might chase down a lot of blind alleys, but that's something. But for me, the best briefs or the best way for me to work with people who brief, which are generally planners now, is to take in what they have to say, and not as an absolute, not as this is, you're just a craftsman. You're just, I hate the word wordsmith. You're just a wordsmith. You have to make my insight pretty, but to make it as a starting point. And often, when I was still today, when I work, I'm usually best friends with the planner. I usually play my ideas with the planner because I feel like their job, as much as it's often to do brief, it's to go insight hunting and to be, in a way, more intellectually liberal than executionally attuned. And I think so much of the creative end has become an executional exercise rather than a strategic exercise, or what does the consumer want? I can't tell you how many hours we used to spend in agencies. When a client has a serious business problem, and we're talking about directors. Yeah, a director will help, but we better get to the core of figuring out that serious business problem, at least explaining what it is or overcoming it some way. So, I always like a brief, but, I've never, in all the years I've been working, I've never not rewritten the brief. It might not be a formal rewriting, but it's gonna be, and if it's a great brief and it's 140 words, I'm still going to get it down to 7 words, because I'm going to play back to the client, here's basically what you're trying to say. And that can't be more, I'm a little bit of a broken record, but I'm 64, and I grew up in the days of paper magazines. And if you remember the last time you went to a dentist's office, if there was a paper Time magazine there, I haven't seen one in about 40 years, but if there was a paper Time magazine, probably on page 3 there was a masthead, and in large type in red it said Time, and there was small type underneath that. It said the weekly news magazine. Can you define your problem that well? And that's, to me, my job, is defining the problem as well as I'll call it an epigram, because I want to make it, I mean, literally epigrammatic, because if it's not memorable, what's the point? So you have to, there's too many things in the world. I don't know what they all do. I don't, God's honest truth, I don't know how to use a TV anymore. It's too complicated. There's too many channels. And I can't, by the time you click through the 67th Home Shopping Network channel, I'll turn it off.
Yeah. Well, essentially, you're saying what Cameron Day said last week. He basically rewrites the briefs too. He may not tell the client that he does it, but he and his art director will often be briefed, and he shared with us that they'll compare notes later, and they've circled the same thing separately because they're not in the same location. His art director partner is in Atlanta, and he's here in Austin, as a matter of fact.
Right.
I read your blog post today, and I was really fascinated by how you went into you were contacted by a pitch specialist with an opportunity to pitch a client, and you walked into that pitch with your planner. Yep. Whereas, I as a copywriter, I might choose to walk in with my art director. And I was fascinated by you're just alluding to that fact now, that your buddy was, your partner in the pitch was a planner. Talk about it. Why not an art director?
Well, in this particular situation, I don't want to go into details of what they were selling, but it was a complex kind of lifestyle business, let's just say, that's in the age of COVID is really under the gun. You're kind of questioning how much longer will this sort of business endure, and what. And I don't know anything about this business. I'm not experienced in this business. But, you do your research, and, you look at things online, and you start noticing brands that go after the same target audience, and you start seeing a sameness. And I wanted that to be more more scientific than impressionistic. And, I didn't want to, and I'm not disparaging art directors, but I wanted to be a little bit more cerebral than executional. That, I felt with this target audience that they weren't given really their due and their consideration, and the industry itself had landed on a lot of tropes that were probably pretty dangerous, or kind of like the thing. It seems to me, we'll see on 2 Sundays when the Super Bowl airs. It seems to me about a good 40% of all spots now end with people dancing, and it's tropes along those lines. It's like, are we really talking to real people, or are we not? And, a lot of times I think when you get to execution, we stray from real people because we're looking for good-looking people, or this is how the director shot them in this manner. And we're not really getting at what Birnbach called simple, timeless human truths. And, I mean, that's to me where the best briefs are simple, timeless human truths. And, our job, it's not moms are busy. I wouldn't call that a simple, timeless human truth, because what do you do with it? How do you distinguish it? But I wanted a planner in there just to have someone with I think the intellect to wrap their head around the problem.
A thinking partner. It sounds like to be a thinking partner. You strike me as a very strategic oriented copywriter and creative. And I've always felt that those are the ones that I enjoy working with the most, because I consider myself a creative minded strategist. And somewhere in the middle between those two, there can be a really powerful dialogue in terms of, did you hear what I heard, or what do you think of this?
Right.
and the bouncing back and forth of ideas when the lead creative and the strategist are on the same page or have a rapport, it can really be magical, I think.
I have a weird fundamental belief that most clients don't know what they're selling. They fundamentally don't know what they're selling. They don't know why their product is different. They don't know what makes it better. They don't know why people are going towards it. I'm not talking about a nacho chip, but if you talk to a brand manager at an automobile company, I promise you, they won't. The guy who works for Hyundai won't be able to say why his car is better than a Nissan. And I want to get that thing. I don't believe in parity, and I refuse to believe in parity products, because I think if we accept parity, we're accepting that our job is just in the Toyota dealer commercials that we're going to see tonight when we turn on TV. Who's got the best balloons? I don't want my job to be who's got the best balloons or the prettiest woman walking through the showroom going $149 a month. I don't want to do that. Like even a little I don't like the commercials, but even the thing that Subaru has now in all its commercials, I think they say something like no other car company, over the last 10 years, 96% of the Subarus on the road, sold are still on the road. That's greater than any other car company. Like, I want that. Our job is to find stuff like that. Then we'll find a way to make it interesting and cool and memorable. And that's where creativity comes in. But for me, there has to be a mnemonic quality to a brand. And, when we stopped kind of being investigative journalists and we started being people who fold balloons for a living, that's when the wind came out of the advertising's the purpose of advertising is to make. I'll give you a human example. So my wife and I have been living in the same apartment in Manhattan since 1998. We bought our apartment in 1998. We've lived in the apartment since 1998. COVID hits. My wife freaks out. We have to get out of the city. God forbid one of us gets sick. We're not going to be, there were no ventilators, no hospital beds. So she says, let's find a place in Connecticut. So I put my thinking cap on and I say, well, if we go in the New York suburbs of Connecticut, we're going to have the same hospital problems. They're going to be too crowded. So let's go north of New Haven, which is where Yale is. We'll be close enough to Yale to get to Yale hospitals, but we'll be far enough away. So we do that, and we wind up buying a house up here. It's not like we had money sitting around. But we said we're going to buy a house. It works for us to buy a house. So what happens when you buy a house is you have to buy all the things you haven't really thought about buying for 25 years. You got to buy a broom. You got to buy a mouthwash. Usually we're out of this, you'll get that. You have to rebuy everything in mass. Now, I had a weird experience. We don't use mouthwash on a regular basis, but I had pitched a mouthwash product, probably the leading mouthwash, right before I got fired from Ogilvy. And, we had come up with a couple campaigns, and then invariably you hear from the network people, the agency, the holding company network people, they only want to do work on Instagram, which basically means you can't do anything good. Sorry. So, or, they don't want to dive into the product. So this is for a mouthwash. So you get to the store and you see the name brand, it costs $7. And you see the store brand, and it costs $4. They've given me, when I grew up, I had $3 worth of reasons to spend more. I knew about, germ killing. I knew about this. I knew about that. I saw, the mouthwash equivalent of blue dye on the tampon. I had seen all those things. Whether I liked them or not, they registered. We don't do that anymore. So you're basically going, your Walgreens brand is just as good as your your Unilever brand. Is that smart for Unilever? I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, because they're not getting $7 a mouthwash anymore. I mean, and I think that's what's happened in our world. I don't know why I would spend, if I had the money, I don't know why I would spend $70,000 on a BMW rather than $40,000 on a Kia. They haven't told me. They used to.
Well, you also mentioned something, I don't know if it was in this morning's blog post or the column that you wrote for Dave Dye. I forget where I read it, but you were saying, in fact, it was with Dave Dye, where you were talking about how you loved, when you were a kid, you loved information, facts.
Yeah.
When you're growing up, and you didn't. This is why I liked what I liked before I knew what I was supposed to like.
Right.
Which
that
was
was
eventually
Dave Dye. Yeah.
Yeah. And you said, I love facts. Now, I also came across a clip from a long video, maybe an hour's worth, that was made probably in the 60s or 70s, and it featured Stephen King, one of the fathers of the account planning.
Yeah, I actually had that brief on my computer.
And it's a long documentary about what is a brand and how do we make a brand. And today, I think what I hear a lot is emotional communications resonate much better than fact-based. And so we're all going toward this, we all have this quest of being the most emotionally resonating, which could be funny, or it could be sad. There's a lot of ways to define emotion. And yet Stephen King in this video is saying we must have a fundamental connection with information and facts that resonate with our customer before we can have that emotional connection. So your conversation here is like ticking off a lot of boxes. Little flags are going up saying, yeah, we're some of the brands out there do a pretty good job of ringing our emotional bells, but there's no substance to what we're seeing on the screen or hearing on the radio. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, and I've written about it somewhat, I think, extensively. For me, the best example, and I know I've written about on my blog, was when BMW came out with a campaign maybe a dozen years ago. I think a Texas agency, GSDM, did it, called Joy, because driving is supposed to give you joy. Yeah, that's great. Is joy ownable? I mean, I don't think joy is ownable. I think, a piston ring that's sealed, in a certain way and gives you more torque and more this and more that is ownable. And I am smart enough as a consumer, not as an advertising guy. I'm smart enough to say, wow, if they do that, I will get driving pleasure from it. If you go back to a brand, I would say people have a real genuine heart for, not Hallmark heart for, VW, even today. If you read the copy on Think Small. It's all facts. We use pints of oil, not quarts. It's air cooled, not water cooled. We get about 25 miles to the gallon. Think about the great ads. After we paint the car, we paint the paint. There's no interpolated emotion in that.
No.
There was a genuinely distinctive style that they delivered those facts in, right? And that's what made the advertising great, right? Like nobody spoke in the negative like that. Think small, right? Nobody. So I think there, and it's interesting because Howard and I have talked about this. There's a raging debate, right? The Byron Sharps of the world will say there is no differentiation. Like most categories, you might have a differentiated product for a short period of time, but what you can build is a brand that's distinctive, that's unlike that speaks like unlike any other brand. So when Birnbach came out with that campaign, VW was truly distinctive or differentiated. It was an air-cooled rear engine round car in a period of time when all the cars were behemoths. They had the engine in the front. They weren't economical. But even as their cars started to become the norm, the distinctiveness of Volkswagen is what kept, the brand alive. And I think it also speaks, you didn't really address it directly, but I think, with the BMW example is a great one where they owned the ultimate driving machine, right? And that's an incredibly powerful place to be if you're selling an automobile that, frankly, there are other automobiles that are close cousins, right? There's the Porsche, there's the Mercedes, you have choices.
There's a Subaru that moves.
Yeah, but they kind of locked up a certain area for a period of time, and I think that there's this fear among clients about getting stale, when the reality is, when somebody knows your brand for a reason and it's a good reason, you should never ever want to steer away from that. You just need to find new creative ways to communicate what that brand stands for.
I'm good friends with a guy called Rob Schwartz, who would be a great guest on this, who's the
trying
CEO
to get him. He's my former boss at Team One.
Okay, so let me, I'll send him a note if you want me to. But
I would appreciate that.
We talk a fair amount, mostly by email, and and a lot of it is kind of like, in a sense, you're having a communication with Bill Bernbach, because you can trace the lineage of Bernbach to Cameron, to Lee, to Steve Hayden, to Rob Schwartz, to some of the Ogilvy Shiatts that I worked with. So it's this throughput. And I said something to him, he said something to me, and he came back with a recognizable brand is the most valuable thing in the world because it owns a piece of your mind. And I would say, if you blindfolded a dozen people and said, what's FedEx's tagline, they'd say absolutely positively has to be there overnight.
They haven't used it in 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And same thing with the ultimate driving machine. They piss
and
on
Lexus.
it.
Lexus, the ultimate, the relentless pursuit of perfection. What is it now? I don't even know.
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, Henry, these things are almost limbic. They're almost like, to get all Noam Chomsky on you. Why is the word mom kind of the same in every language? These are the things we kind of believe in as a culture. I know I'm getting a little weird, but these are the things we have to hammer home. And the idea, I worked on Mercedes for 3 or 4 years, and, I can tell you, they used to, I don't know if it's still true, in what they call the A pillar, if you know what a car is, the pillars that, on the side of the front window.
Yeah.
They put out within the steel, they had a tube of high density, low alloy steel. I don't know if Hyundai does it, but I know Mercedes does. I know I'd want to talk about it, because when my neighbor says to me, you bought a Mercedes? I got this Hyundai. It's got heated seats. You don't even have heated seats. You know what I have? I've got something a little more important. I've got steel in here that's 45 times stronger than the steel in your car. That's what I'd like to tell people.
George, are you familiar with an old story called the Capodastro bar?
No.
We were talking about this with Cameron. I referred to it in my first book. The first book I wrote was How to Write an Inspired Creative Brief, and it's in its 3rd edition. And I dumped this story because I made some changes. But the Capodastro bar is an old story about a copywriter who is working for an ad agency that just lands a new piano account. And he's casting about for what makes this piano better than the other pianos. He's really frustrated because he's been talking to marketers and product people and brand people. He asked his creative director, can I go visit the factory? And he says, sure, hop on the bus, goes to see the factory. And he gets the same song and dance from all the marketing folks. He goes down to the floor where they make the pianos, and he finds this old, curmudgeonly craftsman way back in the corner who's been there for 1,000 years. And he says, what makes the piano better or different from any other piano? And he says, oh, it's called the Capodastro bar. He says, well, what's that? He says, well, about 50 years after we make the piano, there's a piece of wood that goes this way, and it starts to warp. It's just nothing you can do about it. It's just going to warp after 50 years. we stuck this thing in here that holds it. So in about 50 years, it actually waits 50 years before it goes to work, and it prevents the thing from warping. And this is why the Metropolitan Opera House buys our pianos, and they're still there 60, 70 years after we. The point is, this was an intrepid copywriter who wasn't happy with what he found and kept digging. This is the point that you're making.
Yeah,
and I've forgotten this story.
I mean, but to go back a little bit to your introduction, why am I anti-holding company or modern agency? Because that sort of knowledge, that digging, is not really, it's, to use the au courant phrase, it's not in scope. Because we are product dilettantes. I mean, when was the last time someone in advertising went on a factory tour? When was, and really talked to an engineer and understood, the difference between, a monofilament and a bifilament. I don't know, or how a paint bonds to a wall. It's stuff like that. I mean, gee whiz, when was the last time that happened? And, I'm not arguing at all for commercials that are wholly rational and devoid of emotion. What, Henry, do you know this this neuroscience, I don't know what else to call it other than a thing called kinesis triangle?
Doesn't ring a bell.
If you're near a computer typing kinesis triangle, KANISZAS, and what it is, it's an experiment in negative and positive space where triangles are formed without any triangles being drawn. So we know, as communications professionals, we know that when your brain adds up 1 + 1 to make 3, your brain gets an emotional response. It probably gets a cortisol response. So if we tell people joy, they're not going to feel joy. If we say, remember that famous Porsche ad, I think the headline was "Nobody's Perfect," and then it's first in Le Mans, first in Le Mans, first in Le Mans, and then number 9 was second, and then number 10 was first, and the headline was "Nobody's Perfect." I get an emotion from that. My knuckles are white. And it's because I was able to add up what the car would do for me. You didn't have to tell me this is much fun to drive.
We've talked about that phenomenon before, and we call it completing the circle, right? You let the consumer complete the circle, and that kind of gives him a feeling of being
ownership.
on the inside of an inside joke, right? Like, oh, I get it. I get what they're trying to do here, or that's funny. That it creates a form of attention that you wouldn't have otherwise, just by saying they could have said we won the last 9 Le Mans, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't include or we won the last 8, but they didn't include the 9th one because they came in second. But the fact that they did come in second made it more interesting, even though they're communicating. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has a book out called "Thinking Fast and Slow," and this is the fast thinking, the intuitive that we want to tap into. A lot of some of the best products do this successfully, but like you said, how many really do the digging?
I look at that ad, and I've written about it on my blog. After we paint the car, we paint the paint. And if you read that, I believe, and they go through, I mean, it's excruciating. We prime it, we sand it, we prime it, we sand it, we paint it, we sand it, we prime it, we sand it. No other car except the Cadillac, and that costs thousands more, uses 11 pounds of paint. I don't know. I mean, I get a lot more emotion from that and saying, imagine the sunlight gleaming off your new Volkswagen. I mean, I don't know. I think that's 1 + 1 = 3.
Well, again, you're making a great argument, as you've done many, many times in your blog posts and the things you post on LinkedIn, for firing everybody under the age of 30 and hiring everybody over the age of 50. Now, it might be expensive for the agencies to pay you the salaries that you are worth, but you're going to get the same, you're going to get the same or more volume of work done at a higher quality and far less time, because your gears and your experience are well oiled, and you can crank things out. Now, I don't mean to say that everything should be done in 5 minutes, but you don't have to labor over stuff to get to a great idea because the process has been well practiced. But holding companies don't see it that way.
No, I mean, I also think it's a discipline that isn't taught, because what's taught in many ad schools, I'm very negative about ad schools, is how to look at last year's awards annuals. And what should be taught is the basics of what makes a good communication. And, I taught ad school for a while. I'm going to be teaching ad school again, my own, before long. It's going to teach. What I start with is I send the kids PDFs of CAs from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, zeros, 10s, and now 20s. So 6 or 7 decades. And I say, you need to find 2 ads from each of these that you like. And then we put them all on the wall when we had walls. And I try to find commonality in them, because styles are going to change. What do we like about the ads? What kind of ads get you? What do they have in common? Because it's likely they're going to have something in common. Just like I'd say the Bible would have something in common with the Iliad and the Odyssey and Gilgamesh and Game of Thrones and Marvel Universe. I would say they all have something in common, the archetypes. And I would imagine we'd be in that sort of place, but I don't think that's taught. I think we're teaching execution and style when we should be teaching. Okay, I'm 64. The joke when I was a kid in the business, or even when I was watching television as a youngster, was there were still door-to-door salesmen who would knock on your door, and they'd come into a suburban housewife's home, and they would pour dirt on the floor, and they'd vacuum it up. Did something happen to humans that doesn't work? That a demonstration doesn't work? I mean, did something happen to our brain chemistry? No. I mean, demonstrations work. Drama works. That's usually dramatic. And that's our job. It's not to win an award at Cant. So that's where I don't think it's age contingent as much as it's discipline contingent. And that we're not, like they used to say about the sports department at newspapers, we shouldn't be considered the toy department. We should approach things with rigor, and we're supposed to be always on, challenging. When I was still at Ogilvy, we had a client who said, no one reads anymore, and everyone's attention span is really brief. And I was always the first one in the morning. And people would start strolling in around 10. And the first hour of an agency, in an open plan agency, is everybody talks about the latest miniseries and how they binge watched for 5 hours. So I say, wait, what about no one having an attention span? And then just this weekend, my wife sent me an article. The New York Times is up to 10 million digital subscribers. That's 7 times what they were when they were just a newspaper. So it's either we can pay attention or we don't pay attention. And it goes back to Gossage. We read what interests us, and sometimes that's an ad. I mean, we go. It's
I think there's. You've touched on a few things that I think are true. One is the fallacy of the short attention span. Well, at the same time that we see long formats like podcasting are incredibly popular, right?
Exactly.
So interesting people talking about interesting things for long periods of time, and people are listening to it
with no production quality value.
Yeah.
Really.
I watched 8 hours of the Beatles just jamming,
right?
Putting together the Let It Be album,
right?
And it was fascinating to me,
right?
So I agree with that. I also think our industry suffers from an amnesia that, about what worked in the past. You talked about product demos, initially what came to my mind was the Jean-Claude Van Damme, where he did the split between the two. That's a product demo, right?
Right.
But it's incredibly interesting product demo. And then I was thinking,
so was the app when the Apple AirPods came out, what I'm wearing right now. Do you remember seeing the first spots where the guy walks upside down? That's a product demonstration.
Yeah.
Nobody sees it that way.
I was thinking about the Union Carbide,
the bird spot,
chick in the boiling water.
Watch the birdie.
I think you're I think you're right. I think a big part of the problem of our industry is this amnesia about what happened 5 minutes ago. Forget about 5 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just awards chasing. It's not, if it's not cool, if it's not cool, we don't do it.
Well, George, now you've been out for a couple of years. You've got a long, illustrious career of which you should be rightly proud. All right, let me ask 2 questions. One, would you go back to the agency world, or would you prefer to stay where you are? And second, and you can take these one at a time, what's your diagnosis for the industry? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? First, would you go back? Would you go back to an agency?
To be completely candid, they can't afford me. Because the first thing I did when I left was I said, I am going to do everything the opposite of how they act. They're a race to the bottom from a pricing point of view. I'm gonna price myself over the top of the market. I'm gonna price myself like a consultant, not a creative. And that worked to the point where I'm not, to use a Yiddish word, I don't want to be a ganef about it, but I'm going to get what the market. I mean, I believe in supply and demand. The agency world doesn't, because it's a oligopoly. But so they can't afford me. Honest to goodness, they can't afford me. And for all their blather about diversity, it's a cosmetic diversity, not diversity of thought they're looking for. So I have on my computer, and have had for 8 years, literally a 20-page document of, I'd say, 300 URLs of things, mostly from the Times, where they take highly complex things and they break them down digitally into interesting things, like how COVID spreads. And take something really complex and they make it really interesting. And a reader would probably spend 10 or 15 minutes with it, which an advertiser would give their left appendage for. But we don't do that kind of journalism. And then to the second question, I read a lot. I'm a classicist by education and training, and so I read a lot of books about the ancient world. And I'm reading one now on Greece, on the historic, the history of the entire, the concept of Greece, because it goes beyond a country. And around 3,500 years ago, the civilization had reached a place that was pretty good. And then they had what's called systems collapse, which is a term I hadn't really come across before, to the point where I wanted to find out what it was. Systems collapse is basically when the weight of the system means the system loses support. It's a little bit I hate to say it, it's a little bit what's happening in America. But it's a little bit, we see it in retail, where you can walk down the street in Austin or in Florida and every third corner has a Gap on it, and then 3 months later all the Gaps are gone. We expand to the point of collapse. And you say to yourself, and I've done this with some fortitude, you say to yourself, I think WPP owns 2,000 agencies. Something like that. Or I think from 20 to 21 or 21 or 22, they got rid of 200 agencies. So what the hell do they need 200 agencies for? That's expanding to the point of collapse. So I don't see what, there's a lot of ways of looking at this, and I've thought about it a lot. I think the traditional ad industry is holding on to their seat at the table, and is not sitting next to the C-suite anymore. And is handling 300 by 250 banners when a lot of marketers have serious problems to overcome. And we're dabbling in execution. And I see this as a game of a much bigger game of than just a better burger deal. I mean, gee whiz, if Burger King announced they're up for review, is the next work going to look any different from the last work? I mean, that's a brand that has probably had 15 agencies in 20 years, and they continue to shrink market share. It's not about the execution, guys. It's about It's about who you are as a company, and how you do business, how you face the public. Remember, what was it, like a year ago? They basically reintroduced an old logo, and we were supposed to applaud. Like, did either of you guys go into a Burger King?
I haven't done fast food before the millennia.
But you know what I mean. It's
Yeah.
like I mean, as a brand, it's completely irrelevant.
We actually did an episode where we talked about Burger King logo, and was there another logo we did, Henry? I forget what it was. We just talked about like what's going on here. We also talked about the sun. What was the orange juice? Tropicana.
And when they changed. So I think you talked about Burger King going back to an old logo, but I think there is value in understanding what people recognize about your brand.
Yeah.
And going back to it. If that's what worked, then you've been in the wilderness for years not knowing. That's why Burger King, every few years they go back to have it your way, because they realize we don't have anything better. That's what people know us for. Why would we ever want to go away from have it your way? Now we can breathe new life into have it your way. Make it mean something different, make it mean lifestyle, make it mean different things. Burger King's an account that I kind of follow at arm's length because I worked on it at one time. My wife also worked on it at one time. I have a lot of fast food experience. But
another example of a brand that's stuck with its message forever is Motel 6.
Yeah.
I just listened to, I've been touting this new podcast called Tagline, which is put together by Clio. It's in its first season. They did an hour-long podcast looking back on how that campaign was built around Tom Bodett, and they've stuck with Tom Bodett for 30 years. I mean, they've changed the way they use him,
right?
And they've tried to keep up with the times, but they've stuck with us. It's like Nike. They've stuck with a tagline, and they haven't abandoned it. Where brands get tired of their taglines or the message long before customers do, before they do.
I want to get back to something you said, George, and I agree completely in terms of, the holding company model has definitely had a deleterious effect on the industry, right? Because it is, dominated by 5 major players globally at this point. And it's interesting because the industry, when it was in its heyday, was a very decentralized industry. Right. A lot of independent agencies from, New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis. Every major city had a thriving agency business that would cater to local and regional clients. Right. And then you had on the coast, you had the big agencies and in Chicago that worked on the national accounts, and it was very vibrant because of that. And there was a lot of experimentation because there was so much kind of decentralization. So I think part of it is self-inflicted by the industry itself, right? Like all this rolling up of it. But I think there's also this convergence of back in the heyday of advertising, the clients themselves were not publicly held corporations. A lot of them were privately held corporations. So the agency president had the CEO of the company, who was the owner of the company, on speed dial, or the secretary had him on speed dial, right? And I don't think that's the case anymore. You pointed out that, we're vendors that execute at a level far below where the big decisions are being made in the C-suite. And that's a major issue. But my optimistic side says that everything is a pendulum. And eventually I got to believe that there'll be some independent agency that'll spring up and become the next big thing. And, just like we see clients taking advertising in-house and then getting rid of their in-house agencies and going, I think there's a pendulum shift. And at some point, we might start seeing a new breed of independent agencies cropping up.
I agree with that. My just to complete the circle, so to speak, my view on the agency business, on the holding company business is very similar to what's happened in the journalism business. I mean, venture capital, if you look at what's the name of them? Is it Arden? It's the people who just bought the Denver Post and the Chicago Tribune. Anyway, venture capital has kind of turned the newspaper business into an extractive industry. And that's a little bit like a Walmart, takes out 95 cents out of every dollar out of a town and essentially sends it to
Bentonville, yeah.
And the same thing is happening in the ad industry. So I think it's really hard to. I agree with you. There's going to be a regeneration, but whether or not any of those regenerated companies will viably compete, on a Ford level account or a Verizon level account with, World Group LLC.com. I don't know. It's
Well,
hard
George,
for me to
what
see.
are you optimistic about? What are you optimistic about, George, about the industry? Why don't we close on an up note?
I'm optimistic about my business. No, seriously, because
Good.
I see this cognitive dissonance in the industry where, the last 2 weeks, everyone's saying they're on a jury. And then in 4 weeks from now, everybody will be saying they're going to an award show. And in 8 weeks from now, it's everybody's won an award. But you turn on the TV, the work sucks. So I have a hard time with that. So, I don't know really, to be honest with you, what I'm optimistic about, the industry, because it just doesn't seem like a great way to make a living anymore. If I were a young person, some friends and I are putting together a school. This is, you're the first people outside of my circle I'm telling this to.
Scoop.
Where we're going to talk about what advertising does and why we need it. So it's not about how we do advertising, it's about why we advertise. And I think that's, in a weird way, what a lot of our discussion was about. It's not right. How do I get this director, or how do I get this talent, or how do I shoot 1:1 and 16:9. It's about why we do it, why it works, and why it's important, and why some of the many of the biggest brands that we actually feel good about, Nike, Apple, we all mentioned on this call, McDonald's to a lesser degree probably, were built on advertising. Not right. Built on $49 a month, but we're built on, there's a real love for those brands, I'd say, built on advertising. And I think, from an industry POV, we have to get back to saying I'm not stealing from Kevin Roberts, I don't know the guy, but we have to get back to making brands people love, not for spurious reasons because we've got this celebrity or that celebrity, but they actually help make my life better.
Right.
And I'm not talking about removing ocean plastic. They make my life better. Like I would say, Apple made me a better copywriter. Nike made me a better physical human being.
So, George, that's a great way to end, and we appreciate the little scoop you've given us. And we're going to tease that for all it's worth.
Okay.
You've been a great guest. We appreciate you joining us at kind of the last minute and
Well,
dealing with our little technical.
Me.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. George Tannenbaum, thank you so much for being a guest on the Brief Brothers.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a great weekend.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time.
We're getting good at this.
Yeah.